50 years ago, this dream of conquering gravity remained just that, a fairy tale image. Until one night in 1847, when a Parisian audience sat down to witness the latest creation of the man they now call the father of modern magic. The illusion was the ethereal suspension, and it was inspired by tales from the Far East. This is the story of how the dream of levitation and fantasies of the mysterious East combined to usher in magic's golden age. Magic entered what has come to be known as its golden age in the early 1800s, a time when magicians were traveling the world looking for inspiration.
In the 19th century, there was a particularly increased communication between the East and the West, the colonialism of Britain. The West was becoming more familiar with the mystical East, but yet it still remained mysterious.
Very early on, there were reports from Western travelers of extraordinary things they saw in India, people doing with snakes, mutilating their bodies, hanging from hooks. These stories came back that created the mystique or the image of a place where miraculous things happened.
In 1832 or so, the British press began to report an air Brahmin, a man supposedly called Sheshal in Madras, who apparently can sit in the air. And they include an etching of Sheshal sitting cross-legged in the air, his hand resting on a staff which is connected to the ground. This becomes a very popular story, and the British press seem to be completely unable to explain how this bizarre illusion takes place.
Westerners have always been fascinated by exotic stories of the East. Whether they're fables or fact, it doesn't really matter, but the East holds something extraordinary.
It took a very special performer to make use of the stories of the floating air Brahmin. His name was Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin.
Robert Houdin is the great transitional figure in the history of magic. He's the benchmark of which we measure before him and after him.
Before Robert Houdin, magicians presented themselves as wizard-like figures belonging to the world of the superstitious and the supernatural.
Robert Houdin revolutionized magic. They call him the father of modern magic because he discarded the big hat. He discarded the big, regalia type of outfits and dressed in normal, accessible evening clothes. He was the David Blaine and the Darren Brown of his time.
He wore the style of the day, very slim, whereas in the past people could say, it's under your cloak. They changed it to, it's up your sleeve. It's just, he became a modern day performer.
In the 1840s, Robert Houdin had opened a small magic theatre in Paris. His new style of magic quickly took off when he first introduced his interpretation of the Indian mystics' levitation. He called this the ethereal suspension.
If you had bought a ticket in Paris for the Théâtre de Robert Houdin, based on the advertising of the ethereal suspension, when you walked in and took your seat, there would be a tiny proscenium march, and it would be an elegant salon. And you would sit there with your contemporaries, the elite of Paris, the sophisticates, and Robert Houdin's son came on. He was a tiny boy, Robert Houdin would take his walking stick and place it next to the boy. Then they would take a jar of ether and wave the smelliness around under the boy. And then the boy would go to sleep and would be lighter than air, which was, of course, what ether was. And they would pick the boy up and he would just weigh nothing. And there he would be balanced on one stick.
The illusion instantly captured the public imagination.
You're dealing with the Enlightenment around now. So he used the newest invention of the time, ether, because you're moving from regular consciousness now to an extraordinary altered state of consciousness. So he used this scientific hook to bring it to the galleries of Europe and to, you know, entertain the minds of the time.
There's no question that it was a great illusion, a fantastic illusion. And it started everyone talking because what they saw was they saw a body defying gravity. And it's been performed in different forms up until today. It's still a very popular illusion, which proves how important it was 150 years ago.
One of the things about magic is that there's nothing that's truly original under the sun. It's all been done before. So what comes into play instead is personality, presentation, a sense of what the audience wants.
You can give a magician a trick in a script, but if it's not inspired, it's going to fall flat. You can have an inspired magician with a great script, but if it doesn't have a good trick or a good effect, you have no theater. You really need a combination of three elements to create magical presentation: script, the story, the effect, and inspiration.
All new tricks do eventually become old hat, but in the hands of a great magician like the German conjurer Hans Moretti, the by then 140-year-old ethereal suspension gained a new lease of life.
It's based really on the Robert Houdin ethereal levitation with the little boy. Basically the same look to it, you know, except that Hans Moretti made a paper tree and Helga stands with her arms above this, and then he lifts her legs up until she's horizontal, and she wasn't a small lady. And then he takes a pair of big scissors, big shears, and he starts chopping the one under her legs, and because that all falls down, and she's apparently resting in space on top of this very flimsy paper tree.
And to this day, the magician has sought to convince his audience that he has the power to defy gravity. But why does this idea have such a potent appeal to magic?
I think humans have always been fascinated with flight, whether it's watching birds soar overhead effortlessly, looking up at the vast expanse of the stars. In early cultures, the shamans would travel to other worlds and fly and gain these miraculous powers and then tell the tribe about them, and the myths and the legends would start.
Witches, shamans, sorcerers of all kinds have always drawn to themselves the idea of being able to fly. It's the great supernatural thing to be able to do, to drift above the ground.
Today, magicians are always improving their techniques for levitation because essentially I think it's our their techniques for levitation because essentially I think it's our desire to free ourselves from the material world and journey off into the spiritual world.
A journey undertaken not only by magicians. In 1868, a Westerner claimed that he too could really fly, but that this wasn't to do with magic. It was due to the power of spiritualism.
The most famous spiritualist medium of the Victorian period was Daniel Hume, or D.D. Hume as he was called. He conducted seances for virtually everyone who was anybody in the Victorian period, and he became a huge celebrity. He conducted seances for the Tsar of Russia, for Napoleon III. At his seances, he would levitate up to the ceiling. Hume's most famous levitation is called the Ashley Place levitation. He is supposed to have floated out of a window in an upper story flat in London and then floated in the adjacent window. 3 people were present, 2 accounts were given. They don't quite match up, but they agree on some details. There's been decades and decades of controversy in the world of psychical research about how this levitation could have taken place.
Even though he did it in the dark, evidence was shown later by the fact there was handwriting on the ceiling.
There was a massive upsurge in interest in spiritualism in the mid-19th century amongst the Victorians. Partly, I think, as a reaction against a world that was seen as increasingly mechanistic, mechanical, and rational.
People are suffering a crisis of faith. Because of the questions that science is raising, people are starting to doubt more and more. And what modern spiritualism offers is empirical evidence, apparently scientific evidence, of an afterlife.
Home and the spiritualist movement, along with their floating bodies and floating tables, kind of fueled the magicians of the later part of the 19th century to reproduce these effects.
The most significant British magician of the day, John Neville Maskelyne, was very quick to exploit the ideas thrown up by this huge interest in the supernatural.
Maskelyne was a pioneer of stage levitation. Unlike the previous effects, which magicians would call suspensions, where you're still in touch with something, this is a free-floating effect where the individual appears to be in touch with nothing whatsoever.
Maskelyne first achieved levitation in 1867 when he caused his wife to rise into the air. She was in a standing position, and then she returned to the stage. The Times wrote in their review, "The lady simply rises directly off the floor where there is no trap and remains suspended, full in the light, with nothing under her feet, over her head, or in any way visibly connected with her."
To see a levitation in the theatre in the 1870s, 1880s must have been an extraordinary experience, because what you were seeing was something that, of course, simply couldn't happen.
When that body starts to float up in the air, and you've got to remember it floated right up in the air and all the way down to the stage. I mean, it was spooky, it was unreal, it would cause women to ask for smelling salts in those days.
Coleridge used the wonderful phrase, the suspension of disbelief, for what happens to audiences generally in the theatre. And that's what an audience, in a way, was doing. It was either suspending its disbelief or having its belief challenged.
A number of the big important spiritualists at the time had claimed to master the art of levitation in the seance room. And Maskelyne always wanted to outdo them.
I think you have to remember how Maskelyne started in magic. He was a clockmaker, or watch repairer, living in Cheltenham in the 1860s. But he was also an amateur magician, a keen amateur magician. And he went to see a spiritualist act called the Davenport Brothers. And they were tied up by members of the audience, but still they would produce a seance. And they said it was all due to spiritualism.
We give to you the spirit cabinet.
One of the Davenport's effects was the levitation of objects whilst they appeared to be tied up inside a cabinet. The day the young Maskelyne went to see the act, he saw something no one else noticed.
The theatre was blacked out, but the curtain, one of the curtains had slipped and let some light in, and Maskelyne realised how the tricks were being done. So he stood up, must have been a brash young fellow, he stood up and said, "I can reproduce everything they've done, and it won't be by spiritualism, it will be by magic."
That beam of sunlight was maybe the most important divine intervention in the history of magic, because that's what put John Neville Maskelyne to business.
The young clockmaker and skeptic copied the spiritualists' levitations, but improved upon them.
There were probably 5 or 6 very important, significant Maskelyne levitations. It was a theme he returned to over and over again, and every time he went back to it, he improved it with the real keen eye of a mechanician.
Maskelyne developed this levitation where he himself, in a standing position, rose and floated all the way up to the roof of the theater. It wasn't that high, but any roof is high enough that it'd make you think twice before going up there. But that required a huge amount of mechanism and a huge amount of operation. Very technically complicated, very difficult to operate, and takes great skill for the people backstage who are doing it to keep it synchronized.
Some of these levitations were so impressive that one famous spiritualist actually went to see it and was convinced that Maskelyne had genuine supernatural powers.
Whatever it was, the public were keen to see the shows. Maskelyne was instrumental in creating magic's golden age. Maskelyne and his partner George Cooke took over a theatre in London's Piccadilly. The Egyptian Hall was to become the epicentre of magic in the golden age.
What they call the golden age of magic was about the movement of magic into the theatres, the palaces of varieties, the music halls. And of course, once you move magic into a theatre, then you've got all sorts of new possibilities to play with. You've got control of lighting to a certain extent. You've got controlled sight lines through the use of a proscenium arch stage. You've got pulleys, levers, trapdoors, all sorts of mechanical things that make new kinds of performance possible. In particular, levitation.
The Egyptian Hall was probably a great showplace for a magic show. It was a very small theater. It seated probably just over 200 people. Very tiny stage, about 15 feet wide, which made every performer large and important. Of course, any large illusion, a levitation trick or a disappearing trick, looked fantastic on that stage.
The Egyptian Hall was a high watermark in the world of magic. Finally, there's a theater dedicated to the art of magic, and it captures the imagination of Western magicians who make pilgrimages to this place to see what's brewing up there. It's kind of like the Las Vegas of its time. It's the center, it's the mecca of magic.
John Neville Maskelyne devised what he called playlets, a short sketch, well, not so short in some cases, but a sketch where he could weave the magic into the sketch. And these became very popular as playlets, but really an excuse to do a levitation or a floating of a person.
As the Golden Age progressed, magic rarely strayed far from Eastern imagery. Maskelyne's greatest and most technically complex levitation, performed in 1901, was presented as an Indian mystery in a playlet called The Entranced Fakir.
Before The Entranced Fakir, I think it's safe to say that magicians had some inkling. There was a personal pride of being able to solve these mysteries. And they went to Maskelyne's theater and they were able to discern some of the secrets. But with The Entranced Fakir, he'd come up with a new formula of making someone float. And it was a combination of mechanical devices and optical devices. And I think we now see it was the perfect combination.
The levitation was probably the most astounding thing that anyone had ever seen on a stage. What the audience would have seen is a figure floating horizontally to a height of about possibly 10 to 12 feet.
It amazes not just the public, but magicians. Nobody can figure out how on earth it's done. And this, of course, annoys magicians, because magicians like to be inspired and borrow from each other. One of the people who's most upset is Harry Keller, his main American counterpart.
Harry Keller was an extraordinary figure. It's quite likely that he was the basis for the figure that we now know as the Wizard of Oz, because when that book was written, Keller was the most popular magician in America at the time. He was an amazing artist and apparently a great performer, but he was a thief. But it wasn't only illusions that Keller lifted. He would also take advertising matter, poster designs, and steal them. But the one thing that has to be said about him is that he did steal them very well, by all accounts, and very often improved on the original.
Keller comes over to the Egyptian Hall and watches this performance about 50 times and is totally baffled, like the rest of the audience, and has to know. So one night, he jumps up on stage, he gets up on stage during the performance, and all of a sudden the cat's out of the bag. Everybody knows Keller's on stage, and he might find out the secret. Well, and the rest, he brings it back to America and performs it as the Levitation of Princess Karnak. And that is the levitation that spawned a revolution in levitations in American magic.
What was amazing about Keller's achievement with it was that Keller was presenting a touring show, travelling from one theatre to the next, and every time that they moved, this incredibly elaborate system of pulleys and levers and wires had to be set up in the new theatre. And that was something that even astounded Maskelyne, who secretly got somebody to take a photograph of Keller's rig. One thing that I think people neglect to see is what a huge business magic was in those days. Magicians could earn a great deal of money.
Part of the golden age of magic, the reason it was so great, was that you had a bunch of magicians competing and trying to draw audiences into the theater. And the way that they did it was by creating more and more fantastic wonders that sounded great on a poster. And let's cut to the chase. It was all about getting people into the theater and selling tickets. So by saying that someone could float in the air, by saying that someone would make a donkey disappear, by someone saying that someone would make an elephant disappear or a horse disappear, they were all topping each other. And what we see is that within a couple generations, magic increased exponentially in terms of the development, because it had to have an appeal to the audience, it had to sound fantastic and wonderful, and it had to deliver.
The jewel in the crown of any Golden Age magic show came to be its levitation. So it was natural that magicians sought the secret of what they believed to be the most mysterious and exotic levitation performed in the Far East since the 15th century, the Indian rope trick.
The magician throws a rope up in the air, and he gets a little boy to climb up the rope. And the little boy disappears when he gets to the top of the rope, out of sight. Then the magician climbs the rope after him with a big scimitar and chops about in the air, and bits of the boy's body fall to the ground. And then he climbs down again, and the rope falls down. And then he picks up the bits of the body, puts them in a basket, and waves his magic wand or says the magic incantation, and out comes the boy completely restored.
And I think it's a powerful story on a lot of levels. It's about father-son relationship. It's about boy becoming man. If we want to look at the different parts of it, well, one, we have a levitation in a sense. The child can, climb up this rope. Mutilation, where you get a kind of a death and then a regeneration.
This story exists in every country there is. In England, it's Jack and the Beanstalk. A thing going up to heaven and out of sight and so on, somebody climbing up it. In China, they climbed up to steal peaches from heaven. And then there's Jacob's ladder in the Bible. It's a universal idea.
The very latest research into the Indian rope trick by Dr. Peter Lamont suggests that, contrary to popular belief at the time, the trick doesn't really date back to the 1400s at all. The legend was actually started by a hoax newspaper article published by the Chicago Tribune in 1890.
Once the legend of the Indian rope trick starts to spread, Western magicians go to India and they look for the Indian rope trick in India. They offer large rewards to anyone who can perform the trick. They search and they ask and they spend many hours and weeks and months looking all over India for anyone who can perform the trick. And of course they can't find anybody. Indeed, what they find out is that nobody in India has heard of the trick. One of the first pieces of visual evidence for the rope trick appears in 1919 when Captain Holmes says that he's photographed the Indian rope trick. Well, the Magic Circle looked into this. They actually interviewed Holmes and asked him what was going on, and eventually Holmes confessed. He said, well, no, I didn't actually see the Indian rope trick. I just saw a boy balancing on top of a pole.
Pole balancing is a traditional Indian stunt performed by gypsy acrobats. And Colonel Holmes was only the first in a long line of people claiming, erroneously, to have captured the mystery on film. But his story only served to stir up further avid interest in the rope trick.
The British Army in the 1930s produced a piece of footage in which an Indian fakir hurls a rope up into the air, a boy climbs up and disappears, and the crowd of British soldiers are incredibly impressed with what they see. What's interesting about the bit of footage is if you look very closely, you'll notice that the people start to look up before the rope rises up into the air. And what that tells you is it's reverse footage. That what they've done is have a rope supported in the air and then let it go and then reverse the footage. If you watch very closely as the boy climbs up the rope, you'll also notice that you can see the pole behind the rope.
Although the appearance of the Indian rope trick could be created using trick film photography, the British Magic Circle joined the debate in 1934 by offering a prize of 500 guineas to anyone who could perform the genuine illusion live.
One man came forward who called himself Karachi. There was a debate about who Karachi was, about where he came from. Was he from Darjeeling? Was he from Assam? His real name was Arthur, and he was from Plymouth. And he performed a version of the Indian rope trick in Hertfordshire in a storm, in which the rope managed to move up about 4 feet. His boy, who we now know was called Cyril, dressed in Indian robes, climbed up the top, wobbled a bit and came down again. The Magic Circle saw this. They said, we're not paying you a penny. That's not the legendary Indian rope trick. But the public weren't convinced either way, and there was a bit of a debate in the press. Should he get the money? Shouldn't he get the money? He didn't get the money.
Embodying everything that was crucial to the golden age of magic, a levitation, exotic and novel, this trick was instantly taken up by magicians everywhere. One of the many was Harry Keller's successor, the American Howard Thurston.
He advertised these bizarre posters where he's supposedly in India, dressed in evening dress, and the natives are standing by in awe and shock at the superiority of this Western conjurer.
Howard Thurston is one of my absolutely favorite magicians. One of the things he said is that you cannot fool an audience's heart. You can fool their eyes, but you cannot fool their heart. And the only way to really have an audience on your side was to radiate goodwill. And the only way you could actually radiate goodwill was to actually feel it. And he truly loved the people he performed for.
Howard Thurston had bought Harry Keller's show. This included an act called The Levitation of Princess Karnak. Thurston went on to become America's most influential and popular magician.
There's an extraordinary lineage to this levitation illusion, starting with masculine's ideas being utilized in Keller's Levitation of Princess Karnak. And then Keller, at the end of his career, turns over the mantle of magic, the cape, to young Howard Thurston.
Keller chose Thurston as his successor because he believed America only had room in its heart for one great magician at any time. Eventually, he handed over the reins of the world's biggest magic show to his protege, showing characteristic desire to control his own legacy. This included the Princess Karnak levitation.
It was a great illusion in Keller's show, but it was an unbelievable illusion in Thurston's show. And part of it, I think, was his fascination with the East. Thurston had toured India when he was a young performer. So he introduced this illusion as a mystery of India. Many people in his audience, certainly the children, left that day convinced that they had seen a real, live miracle. That they had seen a lady suspended in midair, a floating princess from India. And as Thurston told his audiences, if you touch the ring of the floating princess, your wish will come true. And in order to prove the point, he would have a small boy come up from the audience, and he would lift him, standing him next to the floating lady, and have him touch the ring of her. He would intone a blessing, a mysterious blessing from the East, send the boy back to his seat. There's no question the effect that that had on those hundreds of little boys that got to make that wish, and there's also no question of the effect that it had on the thousands and thousands of people that got to watch that moment. That was not just technical magic, that was not just machinery, that was really a miracle. Howard Thurston grew up very tough life on the streets in Ohio, and he probably was part con man and part minister, and he ended up being a magician. And somehow, although that seems strange, it all fits together perfectly.
Howard Thurston has a fascinating story in his autobiography. He was in a small town in Georgia. There was a young boy who was injured, had a leg ripped off. Thurston crouched over the boy and said that nobody was willing to help him, and Thurston started yelling to the crowd, "If you do not help this boy, I will put my magician's curse on you." And then they all started helping out. And then, as he said, as the boy was dying in his arms, he looked up at Thurston and said, "Are you Jesus?" And Thurston, well, he said he had no choice. He said, this boy was dying and was disappointed, and he didn't want to disappoint this boy, so he said, "Yes, I am Jesus." And then the boy died.
During the Golden Age, live magic was a dominant form of entertainment, with performers such as Thurston dazzling the far-flung audiences of pioneer America, as well as undertaking major year-long tours of the world at large. This presented particular logistical difficulties for the cumbersome equipment involved.
Imagine that in the late 19th, early 20th century, you live in a small town, you have no source of entertainment except for what your friends can do or your family can do. The only things you can experience are live and in person and immediate. And that is a concept that is completely lost to us at this particular point. But imagine this. You sit down in a theater and a magician comes out, and they've got incredible decorations from, they say, are Chinese or Indian or Egyptian cultures, and he starts talking to you about things that you've never seen before, and then shows you things you've never actually seen before. We have all, from birth almost, seen on TV some conjurer sawing someone in half or pulling a rabbit out of a hat. If you had never actually seen it before, and it is done before you, you've never heard about it before, it is stunning.
The grand magic tours at the turn of the century were on a scale that's hard to imagine today. Travel was infinitely more complicated and at the same time leisurely. You didn't expect to fly from one part of the world to another in a couple of hours. You loaded up the ship with all of your equipment and you set sail to exotic ports and locations. There were hundreds of porters to carry all the equipment off when you arrived. You took over the hotel where you were setting up. It was a much grander show. You had a sense of spectacle in the travel as well as in the performance.
When you had a show of enormous size that was traveling around the world, you were subject to any number of problems. There were floods, fires, train wrecks, illusions were destroyed frequently. Magicians have great and entertaining tales of showing up in a town and having had everything completely destroyed before, and so they had to just go on and just do close-up magic or make do with what they had. There wasn't really a lot of work in making things lightweight or easy or portable. Everything was done as it would be in an old wood shop. So if you had an effect that was made out of oak, it really was made out of oak. It was that heavy. So that when magicians toured around the world, they often had 15, 20, 30 tons of equipment. Actually, and they advertised this on their letterhead. Charles Carter's letterhead promises 30 tons of ponderous impedimentia.
I think it was a day in which people generally thought that quantity was definitely as important as quality. You know, people would put on their posters, you know, how many people there were in the cast and how many cars of scenic effects that their shows would contain. And indeed, the most popular and successful performers of the day, people such as the great Lafayette, would have travelled with an enormous show and had probably 40 or 50 people in the cast in order to present not only spectacular magic, but great spectacle.
Famous around the world, the great Lafayette was the most successful and best paid of all entertainers in the early 20th century.
To give you an idea of Lafayette's status on the British music halls, in 1910 he was commanding a salary of something like $4,000 a week, which is more than Houdini, more than Harry Lauder, more than Marie Lloyd. He really was a superstar.
I was very excited to know that there was such a thing as the world's most hated magician. This would be the great Lafayette, who took a great deal of time trying to downplay the fact his name was Sigmund Neuberger, and he had an act that was very good. However, he hated other magicians, and other magicians hated him. The great Lafayette had one attachment in his life, to his dog, Beauty, who was kind of a little mutt given to him by Houdini, and Beauty was the light of his life. Beauty had her own train car. Beauty had gold-plated bones. The great had gold-plated bones. The great Lafayette had a Latin phrase that was on his door that said, "The more I know of people, the more I love my dog."
In 1911, Lafayette comes to Edinburgh. They book the Empire Theatre, biggest theatre in the land, for 2 weeks. It sells out. It looks like a very, very good week for Lafayette, except that this is the week that Beauty, his beloved mongrel, dies. Lafayette has Beauty buried in Piers Hill Cemetery, just east of the city centre, where it's allowed that the pets can be buried there, providing the owner promises to be buried in the same spot when he or she dies. This turns out to be quite fortuitous, because just 2 days later, Lafayette is to join Beauty. Lafayette goes on stage in Edinburgh and a fire starts. The fire spreads very quickly. The stage curtain goes down, the public get out, no problem. Unfortunately, backstage, the people are trapped because the doors have been locked. They've been locked to protect Lafayette's secrets from the public and from competitors. As a result, Lafayette burns to death.
But if Lafayette was hated by other magicians, he was adored by his public.
Lafayette's funeral in Edinburgh is absolutely enormous. There's almost 250,000 people lining the streets to witness what's happened. This has been a national tragedy. They've lost a hugely famous international entertainer.
The great Lafayette was one of many magicians to use Eastern design and costumes to add mystery and exoticism to their shows.
The British Empire stretched over a fifth of the world's surface. So a lot of people were coming back with stories about India and China and so on. So naturally, the entertainment took on this aspect. It was natural to dress yourself up and, as a Chinese or Indian or something from the exotic East, because it made an impression.
Orientalism became a theme in all sorts of arts, the visual arts, the decorative arts, and in poetry, Coleridge's Kubla Khan, with its stately pleasure domes. And I think this word pleasure is very important in terms of the way in which the West saw the East.
Magicians were very clever in taking up the images of the exotic East. These images were very much to do with sex. When you saw a Maharaja or a Sultan, instantly you thought of harems, of brides, of slave girls. There was always this subtext of some illicit sexual relations. And so much the better if the magician had a pretty assistant who was kitted out in diaphanous veils.
Magicians love exotic costumes, exotic sets and props, and they're always borrowing from other cultures. Anything that's foreign is fascinating. In many traditions, the person with the biggest hat is in charge. You know, the person with the most amount of juju, they call it, you know, the most amount of trappings and regalia. And this stands true in ceremonial lodges of secret societies and fraternities these days. Even in religious societies around the world, I mean, the Pope is in charge, he wears the biggest hat.
Magicians during the Golden Age were emissaries, as it were, from another world. Wherever you happen to be, it was important that they come from somewhere else, to be bringing you allegedly forbidden wisdom. So if you were, say, in a small town in Kansas, and someone came and had a sphinx on stage, it would delight you in a way. It was something exotic and unusual. And it also elevated the magician in a way because he knew something you didn't and was going to let you into a mystery a little bit. And there's something about that that's quite seductive.
But if proof was ever needed as to the potency of the Oriental myth, there was one magician, Chungling Su, who went so far down that route he actually changed his identity and became Chinese.
He gave interviews in gibberish that a translator would translate to English. He had his wife put on makeup to look like she was Chinese too, and this was something that he continued all the way until he died. It was actually a surprise to most people after his death that he had not actually been Chinese.
When Chungling Su died on stage in 1918, performing the dangerous bullet catch illusion, the world was amazed to find that his real name was Billy Robinson, a New Yorker who'd never even been to China.
Billy Robinson was a mechanic for the Keller show, but he wanted to be a magician, and he realized that there was a great interest in the Orient, so he became Chinese. I mean, he bought Chinese costumes, he did Chinese-style tricks, and the reports have it that he did the Chinese tricks better than the Chinese.
Of course, the Chungling Su show was a big show, and they did this twice nightly. Well, now, in those days, of course, there were enough theatres to go around and go forever. In London, there were something like 50 theatres, which you could go around and appear 1 week at each. So you had your whole career sort of mapped out for you.
However, in 1908, he began to become a little apprehensive about this deception he was playing. The Boxer Rebellion was happening in China, and news began to filter through to the rest of the atrocities that were being committed. And he agreed to an interview with a Liverpool theatrical paper in which he conceded his true parentage. But nobody took any notice.
This recently rediscovered footage is thought to be the only film record of Chungling Su that exists today. He's seen greeting World War I veterans at a 1915 benefit performance.
No one was a greater master of the theatrical magic poster than Chungling Su. He probably had more printed on his behalf than any other illusionist.
Posters and playbills were, in effect, music videos, commercials, and PR materials all rolled into one. They were the electronic press kits of the turn of the century. You might not know exactly what was coming to town when you saw a poster of the devil, but you knew it was something. Magicians had to constantly outdo each other about who had the most spectacular posters.
The sensuality of such Eastern exotica was still being exploited in the 1930s by Fu Manchu, the stage name of Westerner David Bamberg, who was descended from a dynasty of European magicians dating back to the 17th century. In the dying days of the Golden Age, Fu Manchu's stage shows were the inspiration for Cesario Pelaez, who's been a magician for over 40 years.
I was 4.5. I was living in Cuba. The paper have dedicated a full centerfold in photographic things to a so-called magic show called The Magic of Fu Manchu. At this moment, I'm talking about 1937. So my father said, I'll take you tonight to see it.
Aquí hay una cruz. Es mía. Muchas gracias. Ahí va tu bala.
The moment that the show began, I got totally in awe. And I got totally in awe. That's what I remember. And I jumped on my daddy's lap because it was a mysterious kind of moment. And from there on, I was fascinated with what I saw. The formulas in those days included a mezzo-soprano at one moment, in front curtain, singing a beautiful song. It included a couple doing beautiful dances. It included all the comics doing funny things. So the magic was interrelated with all sorts of beautiful theatrical things.
For more than 30 years, Cesario's company, Le Grand David, has performed shows that recreate the spectacle of magic's golden age.
Like many things, entertainment changed, and the big shows became a thing of the past. They were too expensive to mount and perform. And like vaudeville, there just wasn't a demand for that kind of show and that kind of touring on that level.
Le Grand David's theatre in Boston is the only place where large casts dressed in Oriental splendor and performing the favorite illusions of that bygone era can still be seen in repertoire today. But in the 1970s, large-scale live spectaculars underwent a rebirth in the casino theatres of Las Vegas, where star performers such as double acts Siegfried and Roy revisited grand illusions like the act of levitation. It is only in Vegas that we can get any feeling for the impact the live, large-scale magic show must have made on audiences during the Golden Age. This new arena for live magic ensured that innovation prospered. In the 1980s, 100 years after Maskelyne had first floated a body off the stage, Las Vegas magicians, the Pendragons, took their art closer to flying by making the floating body move.
I love levitation. Levitation has to be my favorite form of magic. I don't know why, because it's sustained magic, I think.
So when we began performing it, instead of laying there stiffly, we came up with this idea to move and to stretch and, you know, like you could just float right off of it.
You relax.
And I might just fall if he doesn't bring me down. Flying to the hoop was one of the hardest, you know, the most difficult moves we've ever accomplished.
It looks like a clean, simple move, but you can't believe what's going on behind it to accomplish it.
Other magicians like Doug Henning were using the technology of television to reach mass audiences. TV gave Henning the platform to become a huge and influential magic star in 1970s America.
You're going to see things that will expand the boundaries of your mind and fill you with wonder.
Even though, like Robert Houdin, Henning dressed in the fashion of his day, he still enhanced his levitations with the aura of Eastern mysticism provided by an Oriental assistant. Although Henning's levitations resembled his predecessors, he felt a special affinity to the illusion because of his own hippie sensibility.
I wanted to be just like Doug Henning. I mean, that was every kid's dream at that time. And his levitation, the water fountain levitation, was definitely one of the most ethereal and beautiful. The delicate water fountains coming up, the woman, when the water fountains would stop, would just be, you know, dripping water. It was very sensuous. It was very dreamlike. And anyone that's ever seen it will remember it forever.
It was a fantastic combination of the elements, because Henning not only suspended a woman elegantly on the rising streams of a water fountain, but when the water fountain subsided and she was left suspended in the air, he passed a fiery hoop over her. This is the idea of the magician playing with the very basic elements: earth, the air, because the woman is in the air, and the fire and the water. I think another reason that Doug Henning's levitation was so powerful was that he actually believed truly in levitation. I mean, in the end, he retired from magic to study meditation and under the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and he believed eventually he would be able to truly levitate through transcendental meditation. So I think he actually imbued the levitation with true belief, and that on some level this was possible.
But you know, Glenn, we all really have the potential to levitate, to rise off the ground. Wouldn't you like to float in midair?
I'd love to, but I think it defies the law of nature, doesn't it?
Well, not really. All it really does is tell us that there's some other laws of nature that we don't yet understand because our knowledge is limited. It's always limited. There's always a little bit more. It's sort of like thinking about that the magic of today is the science of tomorrow.
But the magician who's made levitation really soar into the 21st century is the most successful grand-scale performer in Las Vegas today, David Copperfield. 150 years after the Golden Age began, Copperfield put such emotion and wonder into his performance that we still want to suspend our disbelief today.
David Copperfield somehow or other always manages to be about 5 steps ahead of his competitors in thinking about what to do next. And his flying illusion is groundbreaking on lots of levels. Historically, it ties into the masculine levitation in terms of its method, but he's taken it so many steps ahead that it's unrecognisable from any levitation that was done before.
Copperfield has developed a new form of levitation that I had never seen before. He calls it flying, and it is. He just spreads his arms and he flies. Now, we've seen that on television. We say, nah, it could be a camera trick, it could be a video trick of some kind, maybe or maybe not. But that's exactly what you see in the theater, and you see it even more convincingly in the theater because you're seeing it in 3D. You'd be sitting in the front row and not see anything that people right beside him, 3 feet away from, wouldn't see. I mean, it's just astonishing. The illusion is so complete and it's so good, he flies.
Now, apparently, when he started developing this illusion, he actually researched how people dreamed about flying, in what positions they went into, and how they glided through the air. And I found flying, when I saw it, a very emotional experience.
No longer hiding behind a false Eastern identity, one of the greatest strengths of Copperfield's performance lies in the ordinariness of his dress. It could be any one of us. But more than this is the freedom with which he moves through space. Surely this is the ultimate realization of our universal human dream of flying.
People want to believe. This is one of those facts that magicians can compromise very easily. In each one of us, there is a desire to be led somewhere, to think that there's something beyond yourself, beyond your understanding. And magicians simply take advantage of that in generally fairly positive ways.
The real secret of magic is not what the magician does. It's what's in the head of the audience, what they're thinking, what they're being led to believe. If you've got a really logical mind, you don't actually enjoy magic that much. If you suspend your belief in the laws of nature, then you will enjoy magic.
He invites a young lady to come forward. He picks her up in his arms and he flies around the stage with her in his arms and then flies off the stage. And as he flies off the stage,